I'm really happy to be with y'all today. I lived in Georgia for 15 years, from 2005 until 2004 till 2019. And last year I retired from Georgia Council on Substance Abuse and moved back to my home state, Pennsylvania, where most of my family lives. So I really wanted to be closer to family. And so that's where I'm at right now. I'm a person in long-term recovery. For me, that means that in August, it will be 29 years since I used alcohol or other drugs. And I do a fair amount of, I've done some work with Faces and Voices of Recovery, as well as with Center for Social Innovation and a number of other clients as in a private practice. So I don't like to work much more than 20 hours a week, but I do love using my knowledge and skills to promote and support recovery. So let's talk about what we're doing and how we're going to go about doing it. Our objectives are to explore the relationship between recovery and resilience. And as I was preparing this webinar, it really struck, or this time together, it struck me how important resilience is for us right now, as we are encountering so many stressors in our personal lives as well as in our professional lives. And that's so true in the peer workforce in general. So we'll look a little bit at the relationship between resilience and recovery. And then we want to build some understanding that compassion fatigue is real and that it's a hazard for individuals who provide peer-based recovery support services. We want to look at the current environment, which brings some social isolation, increased demand for peer-based recovery support services, new ways of providing these services for many, and it may require us to discover and prioritize new ways of support for ourselves to address secondary traumatic stress and avoid compassion fatigue. And we want to come to an understanding that people who provide peer-based recovery support services and those who support them will do well to be aware of the need to seek assistance, support, and sometimes professional help when we need it. So that's really what we're trying to get to today. And along the way, hopefully we can participate in some conversation as well. So how are we going to get there? I'm going to start with a little poll just to figure out who's in the room, and then talk about, as I said, resilience and recovery, and then look at the area of compassion fatigue and how it happens, and why it's important for those of us who provide peer-based recovery support services. And then, again, to look at what's going on in our world around us that can create additional stressors for us and for those people that we're providing services to. And then look at the symptoms of compassion fatigue and how do we prevent it and address it. So that's where we're going to go. We have a little bit more than an hour. And as Ed said, if you raise your hand, we'll try and respond to your questions as we go along. And then we'll provide you some opportunity to have some conversations with each other as well. So let's talk about resilience and recovery. So one of my backgrounds, as Ed mentioned, I've done a number of things. I have a degree in organization development and have worked for about 20 years in the field of organization development as a professional. So I always keep up with things that are coming out in that arena. And resilience has been a big topic for a number of years. So I want to talk a little bit, and this quote is actually from Harvard Business Review, but I think it has some meaning for those of us who are in recovery or recovering from difficulties in our life. And resilience is defined in this one article by a woman named Andrea Ovens as the ability to recover from setbacks, adapt well to change, and keep going in the face of adversity. Learning to become more resilient can offer individuals the opportunity to improve their life, maximizing their potential and success. So that's a real kind of organization development definition, and we'll look at resilience through another couple of lenses, but I think this works well for an initial conversation here. So I'm going to ask you at this point, we're going to split into breakout rooms. There'll be 2 or 3 of you in each breakout room. If we could get 1 or 2 people to raise their hands, and then we'll invite you to share just some things about your experience or something you heard without telling someone else's story, something you heard about resilience and recovery that strikes you as important. Or you may want to share something where there's an intersection between what your experience and the other people in your room. So could we see a few hands if anybody's willing to share? Oh, Belinda. I'm going to unmute you, Belinda. You may have to unmute yourself. Okay, it doesn't seem to be working. Is there anyone else who's willing to share? Cheryl.
Hey, okay.
Cheryl Long?
Yes, sir. I think the 3 of us had a lot of things in common, and one was that we didn't like where we were, and it caused us to get where we want to be. Some of it by watching somebody else, and some of it by going through it ourselves. But the similarity was that we just didn't like what it was, and we don't want it to be again.
So that was a motivator, and that helped you to become resilient as you move through your recovery. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, very much so.
Anybody else?
Owen, I'll jump in, Frank.
Okay, Frank.
My partner disappeared, so Owen became my default partner. You could probably speak for me, but I just got into things that I learned in 12-step living, and particularly I talked about acceptance, that I learned accepting life on life's terms. You don't have to like it, you accept it. It's an expedient, you move on. And then the slogan, I guess I learned it in AA, is the one day at a time thing, where I'm living in the moment. Tomorrow doesn't exist. Yesterday was, forgotten, and I'm trying to stay in the moment. So whatever might be overwhelming me, some awful situation, I know it's only for that moment or that day or hour, and that that's it. It's over. I go to sleep, I wake up, it's a new day, a new beginning. So a lot of that 12-step philosophy really helped me. I know that I can deal with anything at the moment, and it does not have to be the same tomorrow. I can adapt and, accept it. So that was what I had.
Great. And so there's the motivation to change. We're tired of being where we're at. We want to move forward, helps us to become resilient. Cheryl shared that with us from their room. And then acceptance of what is. And then I think, Scott, you have your hand up.
Yes, sir. Jude and I we're talking about being resilient, and I think it's important. Time makes it resilient. just because of things that happen. In early recovery, I remember thinking about stupid things about being resilient for. I'm Irish blooded. I remember going on St. Patrick's Day. I was dreading it. I was hiding under my bed. 10 years have passed since then, and I've been through things in sobriety that I never thought I could go through. Death of a child, death of a grandfather, death of a parent. And I think we have to be able to, Jude and I were talking about self-care. AA meeting is a very small spoke in the wheel of self-care. I think we have to be able to seek friendship, seek strength, go through things that we, in our guts, know we can't do, but we can do it. We have a small mustard seed of strength and hope, which is harvested from people, I think, that have resiliency. If you want resiliency, study what other people do to be resilient. So, and I think, and the final question was keep going. Just don't stop swinging. You can drown in two inches of water. It's not the water's fault. It's the fact that you stop moving.
Terrific. Thanks, Scott. So motivation to change,
Yes.
acceptance of what is, and then Scott, you're talking about perseverance.
Perseverance.
We
Getting
keep
through
going,
it.
and we get through it. And then I don't have a name for you here, but I have your web address, and I see your hand is up. So I'm gonna lower your hand, and I'm sorry I don't know your name, but I will also unmute you. You may have to unmute yourself.
Okay.
There we go. Thank you. You just started to speak, and I'm not sure what happened. There we go. Okay, I'm going to leave you unmuted, and then if something comes back for you, we'll look to you to make a contribution. I'm going to move ahead though, because we have a lot of material to cover, but I appreciate everybody who participated, and it's really helpful for us to hear from each other rather than just for you to hear from me. So let's see, here we go. So we talked about developing the ability to recover from setbacks. We talked about adapting to change, and we talked about keeping going in the face of adversity. Those are all elements of resilient. From my background in organization development, another article I read way back in 2002 by a woman named Diane Coutu, and I like this. And because you're also sharing about this, resilient people possess 3 characteristics: a staunch acceptance of reality, a deep belief, often buttressed by strong-held values that life is meaningful, and an uncanny ability to improvise. You can bounce back from a hardship with just 1 or 2 of these qualities, but you'll be truly resilient with all 3. Resilient people face reality with staunchness, making meaning of hardship instead of crying out in despair, and improvising solutions from thin air. And I believe that is so true. It certainly has been one of my discoveries as a person in recovery, but I think that listening to some of you share, you're referencing those kinds of characteristics. Acceptance of reality, deep belief that life is meaningful, and sometimes when we start recovery, we don't have that feeling yet, or that belief, but most of us discover that as we move through and into recovery, and an uncanny ability to improvise. So that's another way at defining or looking at the qualities of resilient people. My theory is that those of us with recovery of any length are people who are resilient. We have, and we will continue to bounce back. Eric Gentry, and we'll be looking at, he's really one of the key people who writes about compassion fatigue. But he and a woman named Anna Baranowski in 2013 wrote an article about resiliency and resiliency skills and how important they are for managing through and coming back from compassion fatigue. And they talked about 5 skills. And again, this is another way to reflect on our own, reflect on our own experiences of recovery. So we learned something called self-regulation. Intentionally control and manage energy while we're engaged in the activities of daily life. We learn intentionality, which means that we're no longer a victim of our own impulses. So we react with intention, with deliberateness, rather than being a victim of impulse. And that certainly is true for those of us, for many of us, if not all of us, who are people in recovery. We develop something called perceptual maturation. Our perceptions mature. And Frank, I heard that in what you were talking about, that we have the ability to shift our perception so that we understand when we're in the middle of something that we may or may not be in real danger. But every time we have a fear response, we don't have to be reactive. We learn how to differentiate between what's real and what's perceived as dangers in our life. We learn the value of connection and support, and we learn about building connection and support. So we learn that it's important to feel and be supported, heard, and cared for by colleagues and friends and people in our lives. And we learn about self-care and revitalization. Gentry and Baranowski talk about refueling, and that we wind up refueling rather than burning our fuel and not burning we're burning our fuel rather than burning ourselves. So that's just a quick, I'm going to give you a resource list at the end. And if you want to read any of these articles, it's all available to you. They're all, I purposely selected things that are available online so you can develop further if you want to. But that background, I start with that background because I think as people in recovery, I believe as people in recovery, we're people who are ahead of the game in managing and coming back from compassion fatigue. So I want to get deeper now into what is it, how does it happen, and why it's important for those of us who do peer recovery support services. In the 1990s, a guy named Charles Figley, who also was about a contemporary of this Eric Gentry that I just referred to, was a man who started to look at compassion fatigue. And he defined compassion fatigue as a concept that refers to the emotional and physical exhaustion that can affect helping professionals and caregivers over time. It has been associated with gradual desensitization to stories. Now, if we're doing peer-based recovery support systems or services, desensitization to people's stories is a critical component, and it really impacts our effectiveness. It can be associated with a decrease in the quality of the care we provide. It can be associated with an increase in errors. It can result in higher rates of depression and anxiety disorders for those of us who are helpers, and rising rates of stress leave. So we take off, sometimes because we become physically ill, but we take off in some ways, and our degradation of the workplace climate. Helping professionals have also found that their empathy and ability to connect with their loved ones and friends is impacted by compassion fatigue. This can lead to increased rates of stress in the household, divorce, social isolation. The most insidious aspect of compassion fatigue is that it affects the very core of what brings helpers into this work: our empathy and compassion for others. So that's a pretty lengthy definition, but I think it's thorough, and it tells us not only about what happens, but also the impact on our work. And while the study group for the work of Gentry and Figley was not people providing peer-based recovery support, we are caregivers, and we are people who come into our work driven by empathy and compassion for others. So the ability to exercise that empathy and compassion is a critical component of our effectiveness. I'm going to stop for a minute and just find out if people have any comments or questions before we move along.
I think you're just right on in that definition. It touched all of those areas that I had let go unnoticed, but was feeling some of those points of being desensitized and not feeling quite as sensitive to my family members because I was giving everything away to the people that I work with. So yeah, being aware of that, I like it.
And so you're speaking as someone who's actually experienced compassion fatigue.
Yes. Now that I see the definition, didn't know what it was.
Yeah.
But yeah, I have been experiencing it, and I think I'm in the middle of it and trying to refuel myself.
Well, we thank you so much for sharing this, and you know, I think that you're not alone. Right now, any number of us are, I'm not necessarily right now myself, but a number of folks I talk to who provide peer recovery support services and helping professions are working through their experiences of compassion fatigue. I'm going to walk you through this diagram because I found this so helpful when I came across it doing my research for this area. And I think it really shows not only how compassion fatigue comes across, but I think it depicts so well the work we do who provide peer support and other supports to people with substance use disorders. So if we start on the left, you'll see that, you know, the diamond on the far left is that most of us who do this work, if not all of us, are driven by empathic ability. And empathic ability is really our ability to care for, touch on, relate to the suffering of others. And if you look at the top above that, the light yellow box, we bring that empathic ability and we are exposed to suffering of people. So we encounter our peers who are in the midst of either early recovery, or maybe they're seeking recovery, or maybe they're resisting recovery, or maybe they're trying to refine recovery, or maybe they're just encountering the difficulties of life as part of their recovery. But they're experiencing some kind of suffering or loss. And then the other thing we bring is concern. So you see down below, all the green figures here are things that belong to us in this encounter with somebody who's suffering. But when we encounter this suffering and the person who is suffering, we have something called empathic response, and that's between the numbers 3 and 4 on the screen. So we're exposed to suffering, we bring with us concern, and we have a response when we meet the person who is suffering. Now, out of that, we have something called compassion satisfaction, or a sense of satisfaction. So if you think back to particularly maybe in the early days of when we started to provide peer support services or caring services for other, how satisfying it is when we're able to touch on that suffering of another and in some way accompany that person, and seeing that that has made a difference. At the same time, we get a sense of satisfaction. However, every time we have one of those empathic encounters, whether it's conscious or not, we walk away with something called residual compassion stress. Now, in order to help us minimize and manage that residual compassion stress, we need to learn ways that are healthy for us to detach and put our relationship with the person who's suffering in perspective. So a big part of perspective in providing peer recovery support services is realizing that we can't fix people. Another big part of it is understanding that at the very essence, we do not own another's problems. So taking them home with us is not going to enhance our effectiveness, and it may diminish our effectiveness. Now, that doesn't mean we become cold and heartless, but it means we get a right perspective on how we can be helping individuals. And then that detachment can help us to minimize this residual compassion stress. However, as we continue to experience people who are suffering in providing peer-based recovery support services, we have a prolonged exposure to that suffering. And for some of us, with some of the people we meet, we'll have the experience of traumatic memories. So we can remember either consciously or below our consciousness, we can touch on our own trauma and the trauma we've experienced both in substance use, in active substance use disorder, and in recovery. And then this is the big one for us today, because I think it has such an impact. But every single one of us is currently and always dealing with other life demands. And so you know, for some of us today with social isolation, with some of our stressors around racial inequity, with some of our stressors around seeing the suffering of others on television all the time and hearing great numbers of people who are suffering from coronavirus and dying, and maybe also having friends and family members who are suffering from coronavirus and dying. For some of us who are experiencing quarantine fatigue, this box of other life demands sort of fills the screen, that it becomes so big that it limits our ability to experience any of the rest of what's here. So all of that is a setup for us to experience compassion fatigue. So I just want to get provide you with an opportunity to let us know, does this make sense to you? Do you have any observations? Does it link to your experience? Anybody, can you provide us with some input?
It does. The diagram is just dynamic. You know, there were so many thoughts that were going through my mind, thinking of how this empathic ability is like my empathic immune system. And once it is weakened, it just totally deteriorates. I thought about how hearing you talk about other life demands and how that plays. I mean, there's not, all of these things are coming at you, your pot is full, and there's nothing else for you to give, resulting in the compassion fatigue and considering other secondary, or just looking at this as, you know, secondary trauma as well. So it was just, wow. I could probably just do a group on this for forever.
Yeah, I mean, who's that? That was Keisha talking, right?
Okay.
Right.
Jamie Chrisman, you have your hand up. So Jamie, I'm going to unmute you and ask you to go ahead. And then if anybody else wants to talk, could we try and use our hands, because then we can, you know, really provide a fair opportunity for people to share. Jamie, did you have something to say?
Yes. Hi, Owen and everyone. I'm so glad to be here today. Thank you for doing this, and thank you for letting us know that these resources will be available at the end. I'm not screenshotting everything anymore. This is very valuable information to me, particularly the desensitizing myself from the suffering of others. That's the clue for me that I know that I'm in a trouble zone there, and I like to be able to recognize that before I get there. But sometimes, and it doesn't happen often, sometimes though I get there before I realize I'm even headed there. And you really drove the point home about other life demands. And I think we're all experiencing just an incredible amount of, we're just dealing with things we've never had to deal with before. And I don't even know if I'm making a point, but I just wanted to share. That's what's hitting home with me, what you're telling us. And yeah, just thank you.
Good, good. Thank you, Jamie. Now, somebody else started to talk, and I didn't mean to shut you down. So,
Probably me, Owen, Frank.
oh, Frank, good. Okay.
Hey, you know, earlier you said that you were trying to limit yourself to like 20 hours in the work, which leads me to think about, you know, the time factor, some kind of regulation, meaning, you know, you don't work 45 hours, you only work 30, and, you know, try to work in some other, you know, I don't know, vacation-ish kind of stuff. Is that part of your strategy with the 20 hours that you're trying to work?
Yeah, Frank, I retired, and so I'm trying to honor that. Plus, I'm 68 years old. So, but we'll get into, what we can do about this. So hang on to that thought, because we'll talk about it with each other about what we can do about this. Is there one more contribution somebody wants to make? Okay. Well, let's talk about, so part of this whole picture is that box that says residual compassion stress is also referred to as secondary traumatic stress. So let's think about this in your experience providing peer support services, or supervising people who provide peer support services, or being in an organization that provides peer support services. Those of us who are in those environments can become traumatized not by directly experiencing a traumatic event, but by hearing about a traumatic event experienced by someone else. So think about the stories we hear and how carrying something out of those stories becomes a source of trauma for us. Indirect exposure to trauma may occur in the context of a family, a social setting, or a professional relationship. So the negative effects of secondary exposure to traumatic events are the same as those of primary exposure, including intrusive imagery. So the thought of what someone has gone through keeps coming back to me. Avoidance of reminders and cues. So when I remember that person or the story they told me, I start to avoid either the person or can avoid things that remind me of the person. Now, if we're providing peer support, that's really a critical component of being available to people. We also might experience hyperarousal, which means, what I had a friend tell me the other day is I happen to be of Irish heritage. Someone noticed to me, your Irish is up. So I become short-tempered, easily aroused. Or I become sad, and not always sad because I'm thinking of that person's story, but just can experience kind of a pervasive sadness or a functional impairment. So that means that I can't do the work, or I start to avoid doing my work. In the most severe instances where symptoms result in significant distress or impairment in functioning, secondary traumatic stress may warrant a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. So the secondary traumatic stress can be so severe that we wind up as diagnosable with post-traumatic stress disorder. So I did mention this, but I want you to think about in your own life some of the other life demands you currently are facing. Some of us are dealing with, I live in a building with my brother, and he has a unit in the same building, and he owns the home, but I have a separate unit in that building. And I care very deeply for him, and he's great, and it's terrific that we get to be present to each other and support each other through all of this difficult time. And there are days when I just want to kill him. So that even those who are providing us with support can become an other life demand on us. there's a great article, and I have it listed in the resources in the Atlantic. It's available online, and it's called Quarantine Fatigue is Real. So some of us may find that being quarantined, not being able to live our normal life, not being able to get out in the same ways we did, maybe having even exercise, things that are good for us, limited, can be an other life demand. What are we sacrificing today? And that can be different for each of us. Remote working can be challenging. We can be facing financial insecurity. Some of us are really, really, really being thrown into a lot of stress because racial inequities are so highlighted today, and it's not that that inequity wasn't there, but we've become hyper aware of it in some cases. So I think, Scott, you have your hand raised. Can you unmute yourself?
Yes, sir. Great content, Owen. I can understand the Irish coming out in you once in a while. But I was in Washington, D.C. this weekend at a wedding, and I was talking to a vet that had gotten 2 Purple Hearts, and he was in this battle, and he said he got thrown 15 feet. He said one person in the infantry was not even there, and struggles with PTSD worse than anybody that was even in the fight. And he was telling me that, he goes, this guy, he thinks about this because he has no purpose in life. And then I said, and he just sits and watches the news all day. And I said to him, I'm afraid of the news and what's around us because, we're working remotely, we're trying to get sober online. And how come there's no content of what you're talking about on the news? How to boost your immune system, how to connect with others successfully, how to financially take some classes so you don't have that fear in your head. And we turn on the news and the whole world's on fire, and the pangolins are attacking us, and the bats are creating new diseases. I just wish there was more of this stuff out there for the world. I guess it's not really a question, but a comment.
Great comment, Scott. And I think we can, contact our local and national news sources and ask for more content like this. What can we do about it? Or how do we connect with each other to support each other through it?
Yeah, because I immediately felt better just being on the call, addressing this rather than turning something on and seeing, more deaths. How about more accolade or more accomplishments through this? And that's resilience when you think about it, being able to adapt. So thank you.
Yeah, and I think that's why I start with resilience in this presentation, that we have all built skills for resilience. So how do we exercise some of those skills in this context? Anybody else? I'm going to keep us moving because we still have a fair amount of content, and we only have about half an hour. About half an hour left. So this is important for those of us providing peer-based recovery support services, because I'm just going to point out 3 reasons, and I'll go back and forth with that diagram. If you look over here on the left portion of the screen, those of us doing peer-based recovery support services, what we do is connect. So connection is the essential component of walking with someone who's experiencing loss in their own lives, who's experiencing substance use disorder, or maybe in early recovery, or maybe wanting, needing, thinking about recovery. So if we aren't able to make that connection, I keep paging in the wrong direction. Sorry about that. If we aren't able to make that connection, we're not doing the work we're setting out to do. Jamie, I thank you for sharing that whole sort of warning sign for you is the becoming desensitized to somebody's stories. So if we're desensitized, we're not connecting, we're really removing or moving away from. And so that's a really important part of the work we do. Now, here's the thing that I just want to hold up for your consideration. Because I worked doing training around peer support in Georgia, and the one area that I think we need to explore for those of us who are certified peers, providing peer support, who are working in that arena, I don't know that we're teaching or learning how to do healthy detachment. So I think we're doing almost across the board at the different states I've looked at and worked with, we're doing a great job of helping people to connect in providing peer support. I don't know how well we're doing in helping people to detach. And I don't mean to become desensitized. I mean it differently. I mean to sort through how I can be most effective in accompanying or companioning someone else on their journey. So figuring out how to put that relationship in right perspective and then detach from that relationship in a way that helps me to stay healthy in my own life. So that may be an area that we need to work on. So that's this healthy detachment. And I think that belongs to us, learning how to manage it and to minimize this residual compassion stress can help us to be effective for the longer run. And then the third thing is almost every one of us who provides peer recovery support or who's working in this field has known the reality of trauma. And so we come into these encounters with a vulnerability because of our own traumatic memories. And so while we may not consciously be thinking about how someone's story is touching on our memories of trauma, it may be impacting us. And so I want to talk about this progression that we've talked a little bit about secondary traumatic stress. It is a reality of the work we do. It is a reality of providing peer-based recovery support. It can lead us into compassion fatigue, which means, you know, in the very simplest way, it means our compassion gets tired. And we see that in all those ways we've talked about. But ultimately, it could lead us to burnout. And that's what we want to avoid. So we become burn up, that we're burning ourselves in the passion of providing these services for others. So the World Health Organization defines burnout as chronic work-related stress. Some of the ways we can see it in ourselves and those around us is we might experience or see a lack of motivation, energy depletion or exhaustion, reduced efficacy or reduced effectiveness, and it can result from unresolved secondary traumatic stress or compassion fatigue. And what the World Health Organization tells us in its definition of burnout is that it may not be reversible. So if we want to keep doing effective peer support for the long haul, we don't want to wind up here. I'm going to talk real quickly about, based on the work of the American Institute of Stress, and SAMHSA has provided tips for healthcare professionals coping with stress and compassion fatigue. Some of the symptoms are emotional exhaustion, anxiety, fear, sadness, anger, guilt, a reduced sense of personal accomplishment or meaning in our work. So we might be, on the surface, providing great support, doing terrific documentation, and being the best at what we do, and yet have very little sense of personal accomplishment or having it lose its meaning for us. We might have reduced stamina, crying, angry outbursts, and we might wind up avoiding others and decreased interaction with others. We depersonalize the people we're providing services for, or we become physically exhausted. So exhaustion, reduced satisfaction, isolation, and depersonalization. There is no way that we can continue to provide effective peer recovery support if we're caught up or we become the victim of all of this. So I'm going to stop for a minute again and then ask, are there any observations, comments, or questions? And particularly from someone who maybe hasn't contributed yet. Anybody have some thoughts? I guess just a simple question, is it making sense to you? I'm just trying to scan the group. So we're getting some chats. People are saying yes.
Yes, I wanted to just ask if supervision was going to fall into this discussion further down into the conversation, because we do a lot of things in our organization to kind of prevent, or not even prevent, or work with, or expose maybe some compassion fatigue with regular supervision as a group. And I think experience with mutual support groups and the ability to be vulnerable about our feelings, that had played a big part in my substance use disorder. And being able to do that within the work setting, a safe place to do that within the work setting, goes really far into kind of combating that compassion fatigue, because my coworkers are well aware and trained also to be aware of that, but we kind of test each other when it comes to that, and create a safe space to discuss these things and reflect that in each other where we may not see it.
That is so helpful, Greg. The answer to your question where you started is yes, we will reference that as part of the solution, and providing supervision to peer support is really one of the critical components, and creating a safe space where people can process through that secondary traumatic stress and then learn how to do the detachment that I was referring to. Because that may not come naturally to many of us, and it is a skill we have to learn. But yes, the answer is yes, we'll reference it. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the screen sharing, and so what do we do about it? So I have here a graphic that I put together, and I think we often talk about the antidote to compassion fatigue as self-care. But that can be a rather simplistic way of talking about this. So we have to build a system of self-care, and it has a number of components. And much of this can take place in group or individual supervision. Some of it is really an inner work. But also we need to be in a system of support that helps us to process it and build it. So we need to attend to the physical, which means that we might look at the way that we are eating, sleeping, or exercising. And we might renew support systems. That should include supervision either in groups or one-on-one or both. And sometimes in some organizations, we might have to ask for it. So Greg, you're lucky to be in an organization that places a priority on it. Not all organizations do, but as people providing peer-based recovery support, we're always in a position where we can ask for supervision and then build these support systems with colleagues and coworkers. I believe that maintaining our strong sense of compassion satisfaction is a critical component of staying well and staying in the work for the long run. And then I also think learning how to do healthy detachment and talking with our supervisors about that is really, and our colleagues and those we work with, is really a critical element of staying well and staying in the work for a long time. So if we go back to this, we want to address these tension points up front, and that can be helpful by building this support system. Here in the middle, where we can process and minimize the residual compassion stress. Certainly at places where we are becoming exhausted or tired because of the prolonged exposure, but also here where traumatic memories might be getting set off. So we're going to do one more breakout real quick, 5 minutes. And I'm going to, you'll probably be in groups that are different. So I'm going to just wrap up quickly because we're almost out of time. Hopefully you decided and you maybe heard from some others things that might help you to care for yourself. But I want to really hold out, seek help if you need it. So there are several sources you can look to for help. Your employee, if you're working for a behavioral health provider or possibly an employee assistance program. In Georgia, and you don't have to live in Georgia, but there is CARES warm lines staffed by certified peers. There's also a couple of SAMHSA, there's a SAMHSA resource, a disaster distress helpline. And then there's a National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, and that has a toll-free number. Also, there's a Spanish version, and all of these things also have text capability, and they also have the ability for you to email. So ask for help. And then finally, I just want to summarize what we've talked about. In the process of recovering, we have the opportunity to develop resilience, which can help us as we encounter secondary stressors and traumatic memories in providing peer-based recovery support services. Compassion fatigue is real, and it's a hazard for those of us providing peer-based recovery support services and who have vulnerabilities for this condition. We have traumatic memories, encountering repeated stories of trauma, and empathy and compassion are essential elements of our work. The current environment may bring social isolation, increased demand for peer services, new ways of providing these services, and they may require us to discover and prioritize new means of support for ourselves. And the people who provide these peer-based recovery support services, who support them, do well to be aware of the need to seek professional assistance when needed. So I want to thank you for this time together, and I'm going to ask Michelle or Ed if you have any final comments or observations.